Okay, I think we have most everyone in. Some of you are sneaking in at the last moment here. We have quite a crowd. Thanks for your patience. And good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this event in the American Inspiration Author Series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted that you're with us tonight in the land of history and fashion, learning more about our culture and our clothing. I'm Margaret Talcott, the producer of literary programs at American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society. On your screen is a schedule for our hour-long event featuring Stanford Law professor Richard Thompson Ford and his just released book, Dress Codes: How the Laws of Fashion Made History. Many of you have attended our virtual events before, but for some of you new folks, a few housekeeping items. We are in a Zoom webinar format, which means that your microphone is muted and your video is off. While we can't take your comments in the chat box, we will share some relevant links there, so keep an eye out. We do want to hear from you, though, especially if you have a question for the author. You can place those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Many of you submitted questions as you registered. Thank you for those. We got some really great ones. If you think of others, please enter them into the Q&A, and we'll cover as many as we can tonight. Tonight's talk is being recorded by my colleagues here at American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society. The video will be published on our website in the days ahead, and we will share that link in the chat tonight. So again, keep an eye out. And please know, if you like what you hear tonight, signed copies of dress codes can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just across the river. You'll see on the screen that if you use the code AMINSP20 as you order online, that's AMINSP20, they'll waive the shipping fee for media mail anywhere in the country, which is excellent. Even better, though, as I said, the hardcover book you receive will have in it Rich's signature on a book plate. So it'll be your own signed copy. It's really quite an honor to introduce tonight's guests. First, our featured author, Richard Thompson Ford. He's a professor at Stanford Law School, as I said. He has written about law, social and cultural issues, and also race relations for the New York Times, the Washington Post, San Francisco Chronicle, and Slate. He has appeared on the Colbert Report and the Rachel Maddow Show, and is the author of the New York Times notable books, The Race Card and Rights Gone Wrong: How Law Corrupts the Struggle for Equality. Professor Ford is joining us tonight from San Francisco. While you were asleep this morning, Rich, all of us on the East Coast were reading about your book in the Wall Street Journal. There was a fantastic review there today, which all of us really enjoyed. There's a great story about the 21 Club in New York, which I recommend to you. So we congratulate Rich for that, and we are very lucky to have him with us. Before Rich takes the screen here, I also want to introduce our guest moderator, who will join him on screen after a brief presentation. Petra Slinkard is Director of Curatorial Affairs and the Nancy P. Putnam Curator of Fashion and Textiles at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. There, Petra oversees the museum's newly opened Fashion and Design Gallery. Petra was previously curator of costume at the Chicago History Museum. We've heard some great tales of Chicago from her. This fall, Petra opened the Peabody Essex Museum's latest exhibition, Made It: The Women Who Revolutionized Fashion, which has had some really wonderful coverage. I've really been enjoying reading about it, and I can't wait to attend. I think it's like one thing I'm going to try to do safely with my mask on. The exhibition remains on view through March 14th, and with numbers down in Massachusetts, we all can go. And that's just a few weeks from now. So we're going to have to venture out. And Petra is going to talk more about that exhibition at the end of tonight's program. For now, though, for this moment, I think we should be stepping on to the the red carpet of history, rather, and hear from Richard Ford Thompson about clothing through the ages, what it reveals about us and about our society. Rich's book is really a delight. It's not only a history, it's also armchair travel, it's cultural exploration, and it's really education at its best. So Richard, we're so glad you're here, and we can't wait to hear from you about dress codes. So please take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'd like to thank American Ancestors for hosting this event, and Petra Slinkard for talking to me later. I'm really excited for the conversation. And thanks all of you for logging in and coming out to see me virtually. I'd like to talk a little bit first about why I got involved in this book, because you might be wondering, well, law professor, why is he talking about fashion? Why is he writing a history of fashion? And there are two reasons. One's personal and one's professional. So let's start with the professional reason. I teach civil rights and anti-discrimination at Stanford. And in teaching about employment discrimination, I was surprised at the number of cases that involved the dress code. There are dress codes involving requiring women to wear makeup or high heels or have their hair styled in a particular way. There are dress codes that prohibited hairstyles that are typically worn by African Americans and were challenged as discriminatory. In high schools, there are dress codes that regulate all aspects of the way students can appear. And every year around prom season, there are a number of controversies around high school dress codes where students are sent home or not allowed to go to the prom because of what they're wearing. Now, from the perspective of a lawyer and an academic, people working on weighty and serious topics, often you get the impression that law treats fashion as somewhat trivial. And in fact, judges often say, well, this is relatively trivial unless it's connected to something more important, like a First Amendment interest for freedom of expression tied to some political opinion or race discrimination. And yet I always thought that the legal opinions missed a lot of what was important about the disputes. And in particular, wondered, well, if dress is really as trivial and unimportant as many people say, why are we fighting over it so much? Why are employees willing to risk a good job in order to resist a dress code? Why are employers willing to risk losing a valued employee in order to enforce a dress code? So I wanted to dig deeper into the importance of attire. And in order to do that, I found myself getting pulled further and further and further back into history. Then that's one reason that I decided to embark on this project. The other reason's more personal, which is, I like clothing, I like fashion. I'm kind of a notorious clothes horse among my friends. So much so, in fact, that I at one point entered Esquire magazine's Best Dressed Well Man contest. And there's a picture of me, one of the photos I sent in. My wife is taking this photo, and our little girl, Ella, is trying to squirm away and get back to her mother as she takes the photos to send in to Esquire. Well, I lost, but I understand I got pretty close, number 6. And in a sense, this book was a way for me to continue that interest. But there's a more serious aspect to this interest in fashion, which has to do with the example that my father set. My father was an ordained Presbyterian minister. He was the dean of the School of Health and Social Work at Cal State Fresno. He trained as a tailor at a time when African Americans were encouraged to learn a trade as well as a profession, in case racism or racial injustice kept them from their chosen profession. And so he learned about clothing, about what made good clothing, but more importantly, he had an acute sense of the importance of attire for self-presentation and personal dignity. And he taught us by that example of how it was important. And the relationship between attire and self-presentation and dignity and race was clear to me as a child growing up. He was working as an African American in a context in which there were not very many African Americans. And dignified attire was an important part of his way of making his way professionally. So I learned from that example. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I cover in the book, because as I mentioned, I started off looking at the present moment, but I got pulled further and further back into history until all the way to the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. And in the next slide, there's an image of what are called trunk hose. Those big puffy pants that the man is wearing are called trunk hose. And in Tudor England in 1865, a man named Richard Walwyn was arrested for wearing pants like this. He was arrested and he was dragged before the Lord Mayor of the City of London, where his clothing was cut, the linings were pulled out, and he was marched through the streets with the lining dragging behind him. Another person arrested for wearing trunk hose, understood to be contrary to good order, had the clothing removed and posted in a public place as an example for all to see. So why? Why did people care enough about clothing to pass laws like this? And during this period of time, not just in England, but throughout Western Europe, the number of what we could call sumptuary laws, laws that were regulating the use and wearing of sumptuous attire, proliferated. In Tudor England, there was act after act after act called Acts of Apparel that were regulating this attire. The question is why? Now, one reason, and I think the most important reason, was that clothing at this period of time was not just fashion, but it was an assertion of power. It was a way for people in positions of power to display, in a society that was often organized around spectacle, to display their authority. In the next slide, there's a picture of Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth the First was acutely aware of the importance of attire and spent a lot of time thinking about how she presented herself in this magnificence and almost otherworldly magnificence. Now, if this is one of the sources of your political authority and legitimacy, it's one of the ways that you set yourself apart from the average person and establish your authority and your right to rule. Well, what happens if somebody, a commoner, starts to wear similar clothing? It's a problem. It's a problem for the social order. It's a threat to the social order. And that's the reason that these sumptuary laws began to come into existence, and proliferated as new fashions emerged, and the elite and the aristocracy were trying to control the use of that fashion, monopolize the most sumptuous and the most dramatic fashions for themselves, and ensure that other members of society didn't use those. Now, it's worth noting that the other people in society continue to do it. And they did so not so much to pass themselves off as members of the elite, but in order to something that arguably was even more dangerous to the power structure, which was as a way of asserting their own importance as individuals, as commoners. The queen is important. People paint her portrait. She wears sumptuous attire. Well, I may be a merchant, but I'm important too. And this was a new idea emerging at the time, the importance of the individual, their individual narrative. And that idea, which later matures into what we might call political liberalism, was a threat to the social order. And so these laws, these dress codes to restrict that attire proliferated. Over time, the type of attire that signified power and prestige changed, and it changed quite dramatically. So by the late 1700s, this kind of sumptuous and opulent attire was starting to go out of fashion. And in place of that, particularly for men, it was replaced with a spare, streamlined, more sober attire, which eventually became the familiar business suit. Historians describe this as the great masculine renunciation, where men renounce this opulent attire. Now, it's important to note that it was a masculine renunciation. So although this change in fashion expressed certain egalitarian ideals, it was a response to aristocracy, and it was ushering in new ideas about democracy and human rights and formal equality under the law. At the same time, it was exclusive. It was exclusive to men. Women continued to wear this opulent attire. And women, of course, at that period of time were largely shut out of positions of political authority and power. In the next slide, I have a picture moving forward rapidly in history to the early 1900s. This is a picture of women wearing pants. Now, for all of this historical period I'm describing, right up until the early 20th century, one continual characteristic of women's attire is that women wear draped clothing below the waist. Men can wear pants, and the tailored clothing that men began to wear emerged very early on in the late 1300s, but never for women. For women to wear pants was taboo. It was subject to legal sanction. This is a picture in the early 1900s of women wearing pants, and it was considered to be a sexual fetish. Now, these pants, they weren't tight, they weren't see-through, there was nothing particularly racy about them, but the mere fact of a woman wearing pants was a sexual fetish, and it had a name, bifurcation. So a woman wearing pants was a bifurcated woman. And it took another decade, even a little more than that, for it to become acceptable for a woman to wear trousers in public. And in the book, I talk a lot about the experience of women with dress codes and the way conventions that started at least as early and maybe even earlier than the late Middle Ages, always put women in kind of a catch-22. On the one hand, they were expected to be decorative, sumptuous attire. On the other hand, modest. And the tension between those two and the difficulty of kind of navigating those two almost contradictory expectations defined the plight of women for much of this history and even arguably up to the present day. Another group that was left out of the egalitarianism of the great masculine renunciation were people of color, particularly people of African descent. And in the next slide, there's a photo of people marching on Washington for civil rights in their Sunday best. It's probably very familiar to many of you. Now, in today's political environment, it's often typical for people to kind of dismiss this decision to dress in Sunday best as, the term is often respectability politics. And that has a negative air in today's politically activist communities, as if the people involved here were trying to ingratiate themselves with the power structure or with the white mainstream. But I don't think that's what's going on here at all. Quite the opposite. African Americans dressed in dignified and elegant attire had been a challenge to white supremacy for generations. In the 1700s, there were laws in the United States that forbade African Americans from dressing above their condition. The Negro Act of 1740 in South Carolina, for instance, imposed criminal penalties and allowed whites to seize the clothing of African Americans who were considered to be dressed in too elegant, too refined attire. And this negative reaction to well-dressed African Americans continued. Racist mobs would attack African Americans who were wearing their Sunday best on any day other than Sunday. So this Sunday best attire was in many ways a challenge to white supremacy. It was an assertion of political dignity. Now, the use of fashion in social justice struggles continued and changed over time. So a new generation of civil rights activists, and I have a picture of them in the next slide, rejected the Sunday best approach in favor of clothing that they understood to express solidarity with the people they were trying to organize. These are members of SNCC who were organizing migrant farm workers and factory workers to assert the right to vote. And so they used clothing in a different way. But the important thing I want us to notice about this is how this was a deliberate decision. These weren't people who were just rolling out of bed and whatever they happened to have on. They made a decision that we will all use clothing. We will use the power of fashion in order to make a political statement, whether it's Sunday best in the case of the March on Washington, whether it's this kind of more proletarian attire in this photo, or later in history, the Black Panthers, who adopted, again, a very well-considered, deliberate set of clothing in order to express a new Black aesthetic, one that they felt was more appropriate to the dignity and the self-respect of African Americans. But the Black Panthers, for instance, had a minister of culture. So they thought about this. This was not trivial. And none of the people involved in these decisions thought it was. In the last slide, I'll just talk a little bit about the present day. So I mentioned that there was a moment when the sumptuousness of attire gave way to this more streamlined attire that I associated with the great masculine renunciation. And one way of thinking about that is that that at that point, attire became less status conscious, that we'd kind of leveled social hierarchies. I'm afraid I'm not so sure about that. In fact, what really happened was that status was expressed in new and more subtle ways. One of the problems for the elite during the 1700s, for instance, was that the symbols of status became easier to copy. This was always the problem, in fact, that gave rise to all the sumptuary laws I described. Now, what's not as easy to copy are subtle cues of status that you have to be in the know to understand. This is a picture of one of my jackets. Now you'll notice, you might say, oh, he lost a button. Well, the button, these are working buttonholes on the sleeves. And working buttonholes are now one of the symbols of a tailored garment. They're one of the many subtleties that take the suit, which everyone wears, from the clerk to the CEO, for instance, for heads of state or bank tellers, all wear the suit. So there's an egalitarian aspect to it, but there are suits and then there are suits. And the suits are distinguished by these subtleties, things like surgeon cuffs that people wouldn't know, working buttonholes on the cuffs, things that people wouldn't know about unless they had access to certain types of information. So I don't think we've gotten beyond the use of clothing as a symbol of status. I just want to end by noting that it's not just about status hierarchy. It's also about fun, frankly, and it's about self-creation, what I call self-fashioning in the book. And so the very positive aspect of this centuries-long evolution of fashion is that people use clothing and those early symbols of status, but recombine them and use them in a variety of ways for their own purposes. The business suit as Sunday best attire for a civil rights protester takes on a different meaning than the business suit worn by a complacent plutocrat, for instance. And in the same way, clothing today is continually reused and transformed as a way to assert individual personality. And I find that to be not only fun and liberating, but also inspiring in many ways. Anyway, thanks for listening. I'm looking forward to our discussion with Petra.
Thank you. What a fantastic overview of your book. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I have read it and it is here, and I strongly encourage everyone who is joining us this evening to seek this book out. It works on so many levels, and you and I had a moment to speak earlier this week. And as a person who has studied fashion history, I think I absorb the information through one lens. And as a law professor, we spoke a little bit about the impetus for the book, and thinking about your history and your relationship with your father, but specifically with how you were interpreting law through this lens of attire. And I'm wondering if you can just spend a little bit more time, unpacking that for us. What were a few cases that really motivated you to progress down this path, and then how did that path continue to direct you to these various case studies, which really, in a way, is the culmination of this really powerful book?
Thank you. So I hoped to use laws and dress codes about fashion in order to, kind of as a Rosetta Stone, as a way into getting at what the fashion was signifying. Why did people care? Now, in the early part of the history, that was often easier because they would announce what they thought. The Elizabethan laws, for instance, they would say things like, the problem is that it's difficult to distinguish people according to their dignities, titles, and estates. So we knew what the issue was. In the contemporary environment, though, it wasn't always as immediately clear, but some of the cases that really stood out to me, there's a case of a woman named Darlene Jesperson who had worked as a bartender for years at a Harrah's casino, and then they changed the dress code to require makeup, and Ms. Jesperson never wanted to wear makeup and didn't feel comfortable in it, and eventually lost her job because she didn't want to comply with this workplace dress code. And so he was struck by the way we might think that something like makeup is relatively trivial. And a conventional answer would be to say, well, you know, this is no big deal. Why don't you just put on the makeup and keep your job? But it clearly was deeply important to her. And the requirement that she wear the makeup was insulting. And I wanted to understand more about why. And looking at the history of women's struggles with various types of dress codes gave me some insight into that. So that was one case. There were others involving race, for instance, and African-American hairstyles that were prohibited by workplace dress codes. And once again, trying to understand why somebody would lose a good job because they didn't want to change their hairstyle. Courts and lawyers often couldn't understand that. But looking at the history of the relationship with race and gender and the specific position of Black women in with respect to conflicting dress codes around those things gave me some better insight into why that was so important.
Yeah. And, you know, it's interesting. I mean, the topic of women, of course, when it comes to fashion history, tends to be one that is pretty prevalent. And you spend quite a bit of time in the section Opulence to Elegance. You spend some time juxtaposing the rational dress movement, and then you move into flapper feminism. And I thought, you know, that's an interesting juxtaposition, because I think it's a era of our history that people do understand, but they don't necessarily understand all of the nuances of that juxtaposition. And I'm wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about the overt symbolism of those two periods.
Sure. So the dress reform movement with respect to women in the mid 1800s involved, the most famous case was Amelia Bloomer and the Bloomers, which were this kind of women's pants, but they were kind of a cross between a draped garment and pants. So they were an attempt, though, to reform women's dress and allow women to wear clothing that was a little more practical, frankly, and less cumbersome. And that movement, although it caught fire for a little while, it really ended in failure. Ultimately, the Bloomer was ridiculed out of existence. And in the end, even Amelia Bloomer herself adopted a crinoline, which is this kind of big cage, Disney princess style, dress. But it was at least lighter than the heavy layers of petticoats that had preceded it. And she decided, well, we're going to have to settle for the crinoline. And so although that moment of dress reform, kind of lit the way, the moment that was more successful were the flappers, where they, although we think of flappers as kind of superficial and frivolous, and it's about, drinking in the jazz age and this kind of thing. In fact, these were a class diverse, racially diverse set of women, working women in many instances, and they were women who were asserting a new kind of status for themselves that was quite consistent with what had happened with men hundreds of years earlier in the Great Masculine Renunciation. You could think about the flapper movement as a great feminine renunciation, and the streamlined clothing that they wore was, in many ways had a very important political statement. And I think that was well understood at the time.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned as you were setting the groundwork for this presentation, the threat of the social order, and in specifically, we're discussing laws, but I think that there's also another threat to the social order, and that's this tension between assimilation and distinction, and the desire to sort of do both. At varying degrees throughout various points in one's life. But that's something that I think really resonates in your book. And that tension is one that we continually revisit in different manners. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, points in history that you saw that represent that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's a very common theme that dress codes are often designed in order to ensure that attire corresponds to some social category. And when people dress in that way, in the conventional sense, they're signifying their membership and their allegiance to a group. And at the same time, that attire can be reused or repurposed in ways to express individual identity. In fact, probably the main way that's available to express individualism through clothing is to take some familiar symbol, something that seems, that we have some sense of what it means, and use it in a new way. And so this was a constant historical process in which every time someone uses a conventional type of clothing in a new way, they're drawing on the old meaning, but they're also transforming it, which ultimately might tend to undermine it. And it very much in the way that parallels the individual's relationship to groups, that individual personalities, much of it is about how I occupy a variety of different social positions as members of groups. I'm an African-American law professor. I'm a Californian, but I was born in New York. So, this kind of combination of identities.
Right. Well, and reading those cues, of course, as well. I mean, we speak of semiotics, and you even use the phrase, interpreting the language of fashion is a daunting task. And it's a really complex language, and yet it's one that we all engage in. And I'm not even necessarily sure that we always have the vocabulary to dissect what it is that we're seeing, but we almost instinctually know. And I feel like that's very much a part of this, the definition of dress codes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, in some of the legal disputes, the problem was that the people involved couldn't articulate in language to a judge or a lawyer why it was that this was important to them. But instinctively they do it. Darlene Jesperson knew that whatever it was about makeup, what that was signifying wasn't her. And it wasn't the image that she wanted to project. And it's more than just a message, but it was transforming her on her own body in a way that she rejected. And that seems to be such an important part of this, but it's very hard to describe in language. You almost have to kind of triangulate it through looking at statements about something else and the context of disputes. And so the dress codes were sort of a way for me to get into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I'm also thinking about the opposite of that as well, and how dress has been used as sort of a form of punishment, or that idea of sort of violating someone in their manner of dress. You mentioned the trunk hose and them being cut as sort of a public statement of punishment and ridicule and embarrassment. And obviously someone who lives in Salem, I'm just thinking about the A,
Right.
the very expressive A.
Yes.
But that these symbols, and that it can also be used as a tool for degradation in a manner, as powerfully as it can be used as a tool for identity.
Yes, that's right. And some dress codes would require people to wear particular garments in order to mark them as other. So I write in the book about a Jewish woman who was required to wear earrings, and she had moved to northern Italy, and women weren't wearing earrings there, and she'd taken them off and kind of assimilated to a large extent into to the rest of the population. But religious edicts required Jewish women to wear these earrings, and it had deep symbolic significance because the earrings were associated with the female temptress, with sin, with prostitutes. And so to make someone wear them was a real form of degradation. And again, there was this sense that I got through a lot of these dress codes that this was transforming the body, that there was a sense in which fashion transformed the actual body. And so to be required to wear something in that way was more of a physical violation, as much as it was an expression of contempt.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think you and I could talk about this all day,
Yes.
And it would be my pleasure. But I do know that we have a lot of eager people who have some questions that they would like to have answered. And some individuals provided questions to us ahead of time. And so I thought I would just address a few of those. One pertains to the idea of status, and this idea of people dressing young boys in dresses or in non-bifurcated garments, and what the symbolism of that is, and how that evolved over time.
Yes, I touch on that in the book, and it's interesting that if you look at a picture, for instance, of Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a child, he's dressed in a little dress and has little blonde curls. And so often when you look at those older portraits, you can't tell the boys from the girls. And it's only later in history, or the 1940s, 1950s, where you get a real gendered division in children's clothing. Now, of course, adults' clothing has been gendered for much longer, but the children were thought of as in the domestic sphere, and until the male child reached, a particular age, they were treated similarly to a little girl. And then they reached that age, maybe 7 years old, and they'd get their first haircut. And then they'd be put in little boys' clothes, which were pants, short pants, but still pants. And so that gender differentiation only starts later. They also pink for girls and blue for boys. It used to be the reverse.
Yeah.
So the symbolism of that's kind of fascinating, that there's nothing inherent there, but due to cultural forces, we could have flipped from thinking that pink was a strong masculine color and blue, delicate and feminine, to the opposite.
Yeah, there's a fantastic scholar who's a dress historian as well, by the name of Dr. Jo Paoletti, and she writes distinctively about blue and pink,
Yes.
and how that tradition had evolved over time. And to think about color, there were also a number of questions about color and thinking about, what colors were popular, but also specifically the color of purple as it related to royalty. And then going back to women for a moment, I was thinking about the colors of suffrage as well, and purple being incorporated in that triad as well.
Right. It's really interesting. The use of various types of fabric and garments to signify social status, and the king wearing purple is the kind of stereotypical example of that. Some of it had to do with just the expense of the dyes, red and purple dyes. At one point it was red. So Cosimo de' Medici, for instance, said, one can make a gentleman with 2 yards of red cloth. And that was a worry about the use of fashion and shaking up social statuses. That's why we got all these dress codes. But color was one of those important significations. In some parts of Italy, Jews were required to wear red circles or yellow circles. So those two colors had important significance. And of course, white as the color of purity, and feminine purity in particular. So there was a very strong relationship with a whole gendered symbolism, and the modest and virtuous woman wearing white.
Yeah. So we have a question in the Q&A from Marion, who says, I remember well when it first became acceptable for women to wear tailored pants to the office. Yeah. Initially, it was a Friday behavior only. Why do you think that today's businesswoman is usually seen in pantsuits rather than skirt suits? And I would actually add to that, I think that that sort of ties in also to the conversation that you have in the book about the Midtown uniform.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have this evolution whereas women are entering the workforce. Well, what do they wear? A lot of examples in the book about women struggling with this, because on the one hand, they need to be conventionally feminine. Otherwise it's seen as subversive. And maybe even racy, in the same way that Marlene Dietrich in a tuxedo in Morocco is racy, or the bifurcated women in the example I gave earlier. But at the same time, they need to seem professional, and the symbols of professionalism are all masculine. So you get skirt suits, and then later you get the pantsuit. And there is a sense in which, just as the suit has been really truly democratized, it's available to women on close to the same terms as men, then we have a shift away from the suit and toward, casual Friday. And in one sense, one might think, well, this is a positive development. Everyone can wear whatever they want. But what they actually do is they gravitate toward a new uniform. So if you look at this Instagram site, the Midtown uniform that you're mentioning, they're all wearing the same thing. It's all a Patagonia fleece and a button, exactly the same clothing, although there's no dress code. But that's only available for men too. So far, there's no feminine equivalent of the Midtown uniform. So women are still in this much more difficult position with respect to appropriate workplace attire.
Yeah. So here's a question that takes us back into history a little bit. It says, this is from Claudia, and she's interested in hearing if you have any insight as to the dress laws in the Reformation period as regards to the royalists versus the parliamentarians regarding clothing as a symbol of a political affiliation.
Wow. Well, I can speak a little bit. I'm going to speak a little bit around that, because there's several things in the book that refer to this. But here, I wonder if I can find the example. The evolution of the suit had political significance. And so after the execution of Charles I in England, you had a shift from elaborate, sumptuous courtly attire to, increasingly to this more practical, streamlined, sober attire. It's got attire. It has religious significance as well, but it's the beginning of the business suit that we have today. And that streamlined attire was imbued with political significance. There's a quote I have in the book that says something like this. It's about an English gentleman who goes to Paris in the late 1700s, and that styles have changed in England, but not in Paris. And so he's got to wear the ornate clothing that people wear in France. And he says, I felt as much deprived of my liberty as if I had been put in the Bastille. And longed for my little loose frock coat, which is a symbol of our Constitution, for it leaves a man under no great constraint, but rather free to do as he pleases. So, encapsulated in all that is some, evidence of how, even the typical person thought of this clothing as having political significance.
Yeah. So this is a little bit more of a personal question. You are getting lots of compliments on your suit and attire, and certainly as one in the running for Esquire's best dressed man, there's no surprise there. But Joyce asked the question about how much do people value bespoke tailoring in today's society, and that she, made her own clothes when she was young, including suits, and they took, many, many hours.
Yeah.
And obviously, as someone who does appreciate fine clothing, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the history and trajectory of bespoke tailoring, both in its original form and as it's evolved in the 21st century.
Oh, sure. So, of course, I mean, for much of the history that I describe in the book, all fashion was bespoke in the sense that, it was handmade and it was commissioned by some wealthy individual. Now, there was also a whole interesting market in used clothing. And so that, already gets you into some of the questions of changing class identity. But in a lot of the cases I described, these were wealthy merchants who were, ordering this clothing and still subject to the sumptuary laws. We get ready-made clothing at a much later period in history, corresponding to the Industrial Revolution. Brooks Brothers in the United States, the Brooks Brothers suit is an example of this, and that's a real democratizing moment where people who can't afford to pay for that skilled labor can still have something that's very much like the traditional suit, made in a variety of sizes, so it fits pretty well. And that's most of the clothing that people wear today, and fast fashion in today's environment even more so. Wow, I could say so much more about the importance of bespoke, but in today's environment, it's interesting that there's a whole it's almost a subculture of people who are really into bespoke tailoring. Now, it's expensive, and so that's a subculture of people who've got some spare money, but it is, something that a lot of there are a group of people who care very much about, even today.
Well, and of course that also, feeds into an ongoing conversation about sustainable fashion as well. And so what is the balance between, spending a significant amount of money on a few, exceptional garments that last, versus having a hoard of clothing that, maybe doesn't live up to the longevity and the quality of something that is bespoke.
Yeah. It's a great point, because fast fashion has terrible environmental consequences. It's a huge amount of waste, and at the same time, what we think of as a reasonable price for something often reflects a pretty exploitative manufacturing system and a pretty environmentally damaging one. I remember one designer, I think it was Stella McCartney, designed a perfect white shirt that was designed to be environmentally conscious and also not exploitative of labor, and said, $450, that's actually what it costs to bring the shirt to market. But maybe if you had a few of those, would be better than, 20 cheap shirts that fall apart.
Absolutely. Yes. And then of course that also speaks to, the care and, all of those practices as well.
Right.
And this actually leads us into another question by Anne, who asks if there is really a connection between dress and the state of the economy, and thinking about, what are the signifiers of status now, pandemic attire aside?
A pandemic attire aside. Well, yes, I mean, I think I wouldn't claim a relationship in the kind of hemlines rise when the stock market's doing well since, but certainly status is still communicated through clothing today. I mean, the Midtown uniform that I mentioned is an example of it, but there are lots of other ways. It's just that it's much more subtle. If you go to the Silicon Valley, where everyone says they don't care about clothing and they're beyond all that, you can tell who works in what profession by what they're wearing. Even today, you can tell the venture capitalist from the creative types in tech from the coders by what they wear. So these things are expressed. I think athleisure is another example of clothing that comes with status attached. So it's relaxed. It's sweatpants, but they're sweatpants with a particular type of refinement that are going to communicate to people in the know that they were expensive, that they came of a certain class position.
Yeah. And then I think before we move on to you, gracing us with a reading, I'll finish with this question by Gary, and that is, how did the use of blue jeans by both men and women develop? Which I think is an interesting question to ask, because of course it began as utilitarian wear, and then very, very quickly in our society became somewhat of a symbol of status in its own right.
Oh, wow. Right. You could talk a lot about there in the 1950s, you start to get little boys and little girls dressed in kind of cowboy outfits, and those include blue jeans. And I'm speculating a little bit, but I'm guessing that this is part of that evolution. Of course, in the 1960s, so much changes, and the use of blue jeans, that picture I showed you of the civil rights activist in SNCC, well, they're, the African-American counterpoints to hippies, right? Who are wearing also workwear, Levi's jeans, as a statement of the rejection of bourgeois values, while at the same time gender roles are undergoing another set of challenges and another set of transformations. And so the women as well as the men are wearing those clothing, and that's part of the story. Now, of course, later then you get designer jeans. So you start off as something that's workwear and practical, but before long it turns into a designer fashion statement and is very expensive once again.
Yeah. Well, I cannot thank you enough for sharing this time with us. To all of my fashion colleagues out there, I highly recommend this book as one that I hope that you incorporate into your curricula. And I'm excited to see where this book takes you, and all of the conversations that are inspired by individuals reading your book. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a terrific questions and terrific conversation. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
That was so interesting, and we really could go on all night. I really enjoyed that, and I do absolutely love your book. It was so nice, but what's most important, of course, is the words inside. And as fitting with our series, American Inspiration, we have this tradition where our authors very kindly leave us with some sort of inspiration, something particularly now to get us through this amazing winter. Could you, I know, looking back into history, find us a reading, find us anything, and please move us toward closing. We all need to get to dinner, but we want to hear from you again. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, I'll read you a couple of pages from the conclusion. Fashion is a wearable language, as astute observers from the French semiotician Roland Barthes to the Italian designer Miuccia Prada have suggested. And more than this, it's a tangible experience. The way our attire affects our movements and physical presence is as important as what it communicates. Because clothing covers, caresses, abrades, and constricts our bodies, it affects how we feel about ourselves and our relationship to the world. A woman in a sexy dress doesn't just evoke or suggest the idea of sexiness, she embodies it in a way language cannot. Moreover, if she not only looks sexy, but also feels sexy, she experiences that embodiment for herself, even as she exhibits it for admiring or disapproving observers. By the same token, a woman in a power suit or a pair of mechanics overalls may embody freedom from conventional gendered expectations and expanded potential, her easy, unencumbered movements and grounded posture physically acting out her liberation from the strictures of patriarchy. These fashioned experiences both reflect and inspire our views of the world. The relationship between attire and ideas, clothing and social meaning is a two-way street, or really more of a chaotic mosh pit, with the aesthetics and tactile sensations of clothing inseparable from the more abstract concepts, ideals, values, and ways of being we associate with it. For instance, the great masculine renunciation reflected Enlightenment era ideals of practicality, civic equality, and industriousness. But just as importantly, reformed masculine attire also facilitated a new relationship between men and their bodies, changing the way they moved through the world. The light frock coat of the 18th century English gentry offered a tangible bodily freedom that suggested and encouraged a liberation from political constraints. And similarly, when Black slaves in the early 1800s proudly wore the refined attire of European gentry, they turned their bodies, disparaged as brute and animalistic, into tangible, unimpeachable rebuttals to white supremacy. Reform of women's dress in the late 19th and early 20th centuries not only reflected ideals of gender equality, it also embodied them by freeing women from physically cumbersome attire and from the symbolic burdens of vicarious display. In these cases and many others, fashion was more than a mode of expression. It was an act of self-creation. Fashion communicates, but more than this, it lets us physically feel and embody our ideals and social aspirations. New fashions transformed daily experience, and in so doing, slowly and subtly, but surely, influenced new ways of thinking, which in turn inspired social change. The tangible and tactile aspect of dress is distinctive. It accounts for the allure of fashion, the enduring anxiety around it, and the pervasiveness of rules about it. The distinctive importance of attire is rarely acknowledged in social accounts and social relations and political developments. And in fact, today it's fashionable to insist that technology, social media, and the growing importance of online and virtual interactions make clothing and the physical body in general less important. Text messages replace face-to-face interactions, and digital avatars stand in for flesh and blood clothed individuals. But if anything, social media amplifies the importance of attire. The content of Instagram, for instance, consists primarily of personal images, still or moving, often crafted and curated with a great deal of effort in order to fashion a compelling self-image. Inevitably, a big part of that self-image comes from clothing, and it's clear that many users of social media choose what they wear in their online photos with at least as much care as the most dedicated style maven preparing for a night out during Fashion Week. Other social media platforms are now increasingly image dependent as well. And we use implicit dress codes to make sense of what we find on social media. Friends, prospective lovers, potential employers, and college admissions officers survey these digital records with a discerning eye, looking for clues to personality and disposition. And social media prolongs and renews the impact of attire, for better and for worse. It's always been true that one never gets a second chance to make a first impression, but now that first impression is also a permanent impression. A poorly chosen outfit can never really be taken off, and every triumph or crime of fashion lives on in a digital archive. Thanks.
Oh no, now you have me concerned. So
well, I could give you a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I think it's wonderful. And I think it really, you're inspiring us to continue to care enormously about our clothing, despite being locked in our houses right now. So that's actually really inspirational, and gets us back on our feet. Wouldn't I? Petra's smiling, and I think you would agree. So thank you so much for your inspiration. And Petra, thank you so much for all that you've done tonight to bring your wisdom forward. And it's been a real pleasure having you folks. We have a few more closing words, but really from all of us, thank you. And all of you out there, just a reminder that if you liked what you saw tonight, that you can purchase dress codes through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge. Again, use the code AMINTS20 as you order, and they'll waive the shipping fee. The book is jam-packed with facts and trends. It is incredibly fun to read. It is a history, but it's also sort of a virtual dinner party with characters through history. And Petra, in the Get Up and Go category, tell us a little bit more, I promised you would, about the Peabody Essex Museum and about your exhibition, Made It.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Rich, and thank you, Margaret, and also American Ancestors for having me. Just for anyone who is interested in going, those of you who live in Massachusetts or who are visiting from afar and following our state COVID regulations, and you enjoyed dress codes, I would welcome you to join us in our Fashion Design Gallery, which is a permanent fixture at the Peabody Essex Museum, where we look at all of the different ways in which fashion and design can, answering many of or proposing answers for many of the questions that are actually covered in dress codes that pertain to empowerment, appropriation or appreciation, identity, self-expression, and body modification. And as Margaret mentioned as well, in November, we opened an exhibition which closes March 14th, which is entitled Made It, The Women Who Revolutionized Fashion. So in the next slide, you'll see an image of that and also a quote from the Boston Globe. And really, while this is a fashion exhibition, through and through, it is also a look at the way in which women of various time periods have made a lasting impact in the fashion industry, and how their advancements within the industry paralleled the advancements of women in our current social history. And so I invite you to come and join us in Salem. And again, thank you all for being with us this evening.
Petra, thank you. We at American Ancestors are really delighted to have presented tonight's event, this bit of history. We've heard from many of you in the audience that you're also traveling back through time, doing cultural and family research. If so, our research library might be of use to you. Although our stacks are now closed because of the pandemic, please know that our virtual doors are wide open. You can visit our digital archives of town and church records, diaries, journals, family books. All of these will help you to get a sense of specific regions or time periods and help you with your research. For further intel, you can connect with our genealogists online at americanancestors.org. There, you'll also find educational resources and information on events such as this one, as well as videos of past author talks. So if you have friends who would have enjoyed tonight, you can send them to our website. Even in this pandemic, our mission at American Ancestors, NEHGS, is to educate, to inspire, and connect people. And in the spirit of connecting folks, loving history and American stories as we do, more author talks ahead. On Tuesday, February 23rd, we're joining the Boston Public Library and other partners in presenting Anna M. Tubbs's book, The Three Mothers: How the Mothers of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin Shaped a Nation. So much has been written about these men, and so little has been said about their mothers and their influence. This book sets the record straight. The evening moderator will be Lamerchi Frazier from the Museum of African American History in Boston and Nantucket. On March 2nd, we're welcoming Russell Shorto, the author of several great works of history, including The Island at the Center of the World, about old Dutch New York. And most recently, he wrote Revolution Song, about America's fight for independence. He'll be talking about his new memoir, Small Time, a story of my family and the mob, which has been getting really fantastic reviews. Mr. Shorter will be in conversation with a specialist in Italian history, Alexander Stila of Columbia's Journalism School. And on March 23rd, we're sort of back in New England with some folks. We're welcoming two Pulitzer Prize winning authors. First, John Madison, known for his acclaimed books about Louisa May Alcott and Margaret Fuller. The evening moderator, Debbie Applegate, was awarded the Pulitzer for her biography of Henry Ward Beecher. They'll be discussing Madison's new book, A Worse Place Than Hell: How the Civil War Battle of Fredericksburg Changed a Nation, which was reviewed last weekend in the Wall Street Journal, just as Professor Ford's book was reviewed. Registrations for that event just opened today. We hope you'll join us again at these author events and our other educational programs. Until then, many, many thanks again to our guests, Rich and Petra. We are enormously grateful for your time. We'll let you go back to your day out in California, Professor Ford. And thank you, everyone. Thank you and good night from all of us in Boston and Salem and San Francisco. We wish you a safe and inspirational evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.